All right, so welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a topic that's both fascinating and incredibly complex, the historical impact and consequences of the emergence and spread of Islam.
Yeah.
We've got some pretty dense academic excerpts and historical analysis to work through here, so buckle up. I think it's going to be quite a journey through time.
I think so, too.
Definitely some aha moments coming up.
For sure.
So,
yeah, this topic's really interesting, because it kind of forces us to look at how religion and politics and culture, how those things have been intertwined for centuries.
right?
It's a story of cultural and spiritual transformations, but also conflict and human cost.
Right, and that's kind of what makes this deep dive so crucial. We're not just looking at dates and names. We're
Yeah.
really trying to unpack the complexities of this history
Right.
and see how it still resonates in modern geopolitics and cultural dynamics.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Our first source, Emergence of Islam and Consequences, kind of dives right into a contentious aspect, which is the sheer scale of human loss associated with the rise and expansion of Islam.
Oh, wow. And they estimate this staggering figure somewhere between 110 and 170 million deaths over approximately 1,400 years.
Wow, those numbers really hit you, don't they? I mean, it's hard to even grasp the magnitude of that.
It is.
The source attributes the majority of those losses, a truly heartbreaking 60 to 80 million, to Hindu-Muslim conflicts in India alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the destructive power of conflict,
Wow.
especially when intertwined with religious and political ambitions.
Right.
What's important to note is that the source doesn't present this in isolation. They draw parallels to other major religious or imperial expansions,
Right.
highlighting that large-scale conflict and violence are tragically recurring themes throughout history.
That's a really good point.
Eh.
It's not about singling out one faith or culture. It's about trying to understand the patterns of human behavior,
Right.
the dangerous mix of power and ideology that can lead to such immense suffering.
Right, and it begs the question,
Right.
what can we learn from these patterns? How can understanding the past help us navigate the present and strive for a more peaceful future? Deep stuff.
Yeah.
So how does the source break down those losses over such a vast period of time?
Well, they categorize them into various periods and types of conflict, starting with the early Islamic conquests in the 7th and 8th centuries.
Okay.
They estimate 10 to 20 million deaths during this period,
Wow.
largely due to warfare, sieges, and the societal upheaval that comes with conquest.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the chaos and suffering those numbers represent.
Yeah.
And then you add in the religious persecution and forced conversions throughout history, another 10 to 15 million, according to the source.
Right. And the cycle continues with ongoing border conflicts and resistance,
Right.
getting another estimated 5 to 10 million deaths.
It's like wave after wave of conflict.
Then you have the later conquests from the 9th to 17th centuries,
Right.
with empires like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals expanding Islamic territories,
Okay.
resulting in another estimated 15 to 30 million deaths.
It's just wave after wave of conflict. It really puts the scale of human history into perspective.
It does.
But as we mentioned, the most significant losses, according to this analysis, stem from those Hindu-Muslim conflicts in India.
Right.
It's hard to fathom 60 to 80 million deaths.
It is.
What factors contributed to such a devastating toll?
Well, it's a complex period marked by invasions, massacres, and forced conversions under various Islamic rulers.
Wow.
There's a lot of debate among historians about the exact numbers and motivations, but the impact is undeniable. And even within Islam itself, the sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia factions has led to another estimated 5 to 10 million deaths throughout history.
Wow. Okay, let's pause here for a second. This is all incredibly heavy stuff, and I'm sure some listeners might be wondering about the potential for bias or disrespect towards Islam in this kind of analysis.
Yeah, that's a completely valid concern. It's something the authors directly address in our next source, Rise of Islam sequel. They argue that examining the violent aspects of any political or religious movement, past or present, is absolutely crucial for understanding its impact and preventing future violence.
Right. It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
We can't just sweep the difficult parts of history under the rug.
Exactly. They make a thought-provoking comparison to Germany's reckoning with its Nazi past.
Okay.
Germany has gone to great lengths to confront its history, acknowledge the horrors of the Holocaust, and educate future generations to prevent something similar from ever happening again.
Right.
The authors argue that this kind of self-reflection and accountability is essential for any group or nation to move forward in a healthy way.
So it's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame, but about learning from the past
Right.
and understanding the factors that contributed to these events so we can work towards a more peaceful future.
Exactly. And that brings us to the question of how this history shapes our understanding of the modern world,
Okay.
particularly the rise of Islamic terrorism in the West.
Right.
And this is where our next source, Emergence of Islamic Terrorism, comes in. It delves into the complex web of factors that have led to this phenomenon.
Okay, now we're getting into some seriously sensitive territory.
Yeah.
This source dives right into the role of Islam itself, and I have to admit, I was a bit apprehensive when I first saw that.
Okay.
But they approach it in a nuanced way, starting with the concept of the Ummah, the global Muslim community.
Yes, the Ummah is a powerful unifying force.
Correct.
The idea of a shared identity and purpose that transcends national borders. Imagine the potential of that when combined with the sense of grievance or injustice. And then you have the concept of jihad, often misconstrued in the West.
Right.
It's a complex idea that has been tragically distorted and exploited by extremist groups to justify violence.
It's interesting that the source contrasts this with regions like India and Africa,
Yeah.
which, despite their own long histories of colonialism and conflict,
Yeah.
haven't seen the same level of mobilization around a pan-religious ideology.
Right. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
The source highlights the lack of a similarly unifying ideology in those regions as a potential contributing factor
Right.
to the differences in how conflicts have manifested. It suggests that the unique characteristics of the Ummah and the concept of jihad, as interpreted by some, have played a role in shaping the particular dynamics of Islamic terrorism.
So it's not just about Islam as a religion, but also about the cultural and historical context in which it exists.
Exactly. And this source dives deep into that context, specifically the post-colonial landscape of the Arab world.
Right?
We're talking about the legacy of colonialism, unresolved tensions, authoritarian regimes, and Western interventions, all of which have contributed to fueling resentment and creating fertile ground for radicalization.
It's like a pressure cooker
Yeah.
of historical grievances, political instability, and ideological struggles.
And then you add globalization to the mix ideologies, especially those backed by funding from oil-rich states like Saudi Arabia, can spread rapidly across borders,
Right.
further contributing to the spread of radical thought.
So we're seeing how historical forces, cultural contexts, and global dynamics all converge to create this incredibly complex and volatile situation. But the source doesn't stop there. It also examines the role of the West itself in contributing to the rise of Islamic terrorism.
Right.
And this is where things get really uncomfortable because it forces us to look in the mirror
Yeah,
and acknowledge the unintended consequences of our own actions.
for sure.
Right? For example, the source discusses the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, where Western powers drew those infamous arbitrary borders in the Middle East,
Right.
completely disregarding existing cultural and religious lines.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how well-intentioned interventions without a deep understanding of the local context can backfire spectacularly.
Right.
Those arbitrary borders created all sorts of problems,
Yeah.
fueling instability, resentment, and conflict.
And then you have the West's long history of supporting authoritarian regimes in the region,
Right.
often for strategic reasons or to maintain access to oil.
Yeah.
The source argues that this has often meant turning a blind eye to human rights abuses,
Right.
further alienating and radicalizing segments of the population.
It's a tragic irony. The very actions taken to maintain stability and secure Western interests often ended up creating the opposite effect,
Right.
fueling the very extremism they were meant to combat.
It seems like a recurring theme in history.
It is.
Those unintended consequences that ripple out in ways we can't always predict. But the source goes even further, examining the creation of Israel and the unresolved Palestinian conflict.
Yes, this is another incredibly complex and sensitive issue,
Right.
but it plays a significant role in the narrative of Islamic terrorism.
Sure.
It has become a rallying point for extremists who portray the West as complicit in the oppression of Muslims
All right.
and use it to justify their violence.
And we can't forget the impact of the Cold War.
Right.
The source points out how both the U.S. and the Soviet Union used the Middle East as a proxy battleground,
Yeah.
often funding and arming groups with radical ideologies to further their own interests.
Yeah.
It's a classic case of short-term gains leading to long-term consequences.
Absolutely. Those groups, once empowered, often turn on their former sponsors or find new enemies to fight. It's a cycle of violence that's incredibly difficult to break.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the impact of globalization itself, the clash of cultures, and the rapid spread of Western culture values and consumerism,
Right.
which has been perceived by some as a threat to their traditions and identity. Extremists have capitalized on this, portraying the West as morally corrupt and a danger to Islam.
So it's this complex interplay of factors,
Yeah.
both internal and external, historical and contemporary,
Yeah.
that have contributed to the rise of Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that there are multiple perspectives on all of this.
Right.
And the source acknowledges that. It also examines the contributions and triggers coming from within the Arab world itself.
Right.
Factors like weak governance, corruption, and authoritarianism that create a void for radical Islamist groups to fill.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on the West's role. We need to understand the internal dynamics as well.
Absolutely. The source discusses the rise of political Islam, movements like the Muslim Brotherhood,
Right.
that while often starting with legitimate goals like resisting colonialism or opposing secular regimes, sometimes see factions turn towards more radical ideologies and tactics over time.
And of course, you have the ongoing regional conflicts and civil wars,
Yeah.
like those in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They've created such chaos and instability, allowing extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to thrive and spread their ideologies.
It's a vicious cycle. Conflicts breed militancy, and the ideologies and fighters spread across borders, further destabilizing the region and beyond. And then you have the export of Wahhabism and Salafism, particularly from Saudi Arabia, which are very strict interpretations of Islam that have been spread globally through funding for mosques, schools, and charities.
Wow.
The source argues that this has often led to the radicalization of communities, especially in areas where there are already underlying grievances against the West.
It's like pouring gasoline on a fire. But it's not just about ideology. We also have to consider the socioeconomic factors at play.
Right.
Many Arab nations struggle with high youth unemployment, economic inequality, and a lack of opportunity.
Yeah.
This creates frustration and hopelessness, making young people particularly susceptible to recruitment by extremist groups who offer a sense of purpose and belonging.
It's a complex and multi-layered problem. You combine all these factors, the historical grievances, the political instability, the ideological battles, the socioeconomic disparities.
Right.
And it's no wonder that the region has become such a hotbed for extremism.
It's overwhelming, to be honest. Feels like we're dealing with a tangled knot of issues, each one connected to the others.
It is a tangled knot.
Right.
But there's one more strand we need to unravel, one that ties many of these threads together.
Yeah.
The role of the oil business.
Now, this is where things get really interesting, because oil seems so far removed from religious extremism. So tell me, what does oil have to do with the rise of Islamic terrorism?
Well, for starters, the West's dependence on Middle Eastern oil has led to decades of geopolitical interventions, often military in nature.
Right.
Those interventions, even when intended to bring stability or promote democracy, are often perceived as hostile actions by many in the region.
Right.
They fuel resentment, feed into the us versus them narrative,
Right.
and play right into the hands of extremists who portray the West as waging a war against Islam.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's about power dynamics, resources, and perceptions of exploitation.
Right.
It creates a breeding ground for mistrust and animosity.
Exactly. And then you have the West's long history of supporting oil-rich authoritarian regimes,
Right.
often to ensure stability and maintain access to those precious oil resources.
Yeah.
But here's the irony. By propping up these regimes, the West may actually be contributing to the very conditions that breed extremism. These regimes often suppress dissent and opposition,
Okay.
pushing people towards more radical ideologies as a way to express their frustration and seek change.
It's that age-old dilemma,
Yeah.
stability versus freedom. The West wants stability and access to oil, but the methods used to achieve those goals often create the opposite effect in the long run.
It's a classic catch-22. And then there's the issue of oil wealth being used to fund the spread of Wahhabism and Salafism,
Right.
those ultra-conservative interpretations of Islam that we talked about earlier.
Right. The source points out that a lot of the money that's used to build mosques and madrasas, especially in regions prone to radicalization,
Right.
comes from oil-rich nations. And while those efforts are often framed as religious outreach, they've also inadvertently fueled the spread of extremist ideologies.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. On the one hand, you have the right to religious freedom and expression. On the other hand, you have the potential for those freedoms to be exploited to promote ideologies that incite violence and hatred.
It's a tough balancing act.
Okay.
And then, of course, you have the economic disparities that the oil industry creates. You have these oil-rich states attracting economic migrants, while oil-poor states struggle with stagnation and unemployment. This creates all sorts of social and political tensions, both within and between nations.
Exactly. And within those migrant communities, you see the potential for radicalization, especially among those who are struggling to integrate, facing discrimination, or feeling alienated from their adopted societies.
So it's this intricate web of factors.
Yeah.
Oil wealth, political instability, social inequalities, ideological struggles that have all come together to create the perfect storm for Islamic terrorism.
Right.
It's daunting, to be honest. It feels like we're dealing with a tangled knot of issues, each one connected to the others.
It is a tangled knot.
Where do we even begin to untangle this mess?
That's a great question, and it's one that our next source, Approach to Solution, attempts to answer.
Okay.
It outlines a range of approaches to address the issue of Islamic terrorism, focusing on both short-term and long-term solutions.
Well, that's a relief. I was starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by all this complexity.
Yeah.
But we'll have to save those solutions for part 2 of this deep dive. Stay tuned.
All right. So welcome back. Last time we were talking about, this incredibly complex issue of Islamic terrorism. We went through a lot of that background.
We did.
And we got to that really crucial point.
Yeah.
We dove into that intricate web of factors that contribute to the rise of Islamic terrorism, including that often overlooked role of the oil industry.
Right.
But now we're going to kind of shift gears a bit and look at potential solutions, which are outlined in our final source here, Approach to Solution.
Okay, I'm ready for a bit of hope after all that heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Does this source offer any concrete ways forward?
It does. And it takes, I think, a refreshingly holistic approach.
Okay.
It's not just about military strikes or counterterrorism tactics. It really emphasizes addressing the root causes of the problem, which we've seen are, deeply intertwined and multifaceted.
Okay, so what are some of those root causes they identify, and what solutions do they propose?
Well, they highlight the critical need for good governance and economic development in the Arab world.
Okay.
They argue that corruption, authoritarianism, and lack of opportunity, those things create fertile ground for extremism to take root.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If people feel like they have a voice, a stake in their society,
right,
a path to a better future, they're less likely to be drawn to extreme ideologies.
Precisely. The source suggests supporting initiatives that encourage political reform, transparency, and the rule of law in the region.
Less corruption, more democracy. That sounds like a tall order in some of these countries.
It's definitely a long-term goal, and it requires a commitment from both Western nations and the governments of these Arab states.
Right.
But the source argues that it's a necessary step.
Yeah.
If we want to address those underlying conditions that fuel extremism.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by mopping up the floor instead of actually tightening the pipes.
That's a great analogy.
You have to address the source of the problem.
Exactly. And it's not just about politics, The source also emphasizes the importance of investing in education, job creation, and economic development, particularly in regions where youth unemployment and inequality are those drivers of radicalization.
It's about addressing those feelings of hopelessness and disenfranchisement.
Exactly.
Right, that make people vulnerable to extremist ideologies. It's like offering a light at the end of the tunnel instead of letting darkness consume them.
Exactly. And while long-term solutions like these are essential, the source also acknowledges the need for more immediate actions, particularly when it comes to the West's role in the region.
Yeah.
They argue that we need to significantly reduce our military interventions and prioritize diplomacy and conflict resolution instead.
Less bombs, more talking. I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
But realistically, can diplomacy really work with groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
Well, it's certainly not a quick fix, and it won't work with every group or individual, especially those who are deeply entrenched in violent extremism.
Right.
But the source argues that diplomacy, combined with other measures, can help to de-escalate conflicts, reduce anti-Western sentiment, and create space for more moderate voices to emerge.
So it's about shifting the dynamic, changing the narrative, creating opportunities for dialogue and peaceful solutions.
Exactly.
It sounds like a much more sustainable approach than perpetual military intervention.
Absolutely. And speaking of shifting dynamics, the source highlights the crucial need for enhanced engagement and dialogue, both with local communities and on an international level.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that look like in practice? How do we engage in a way that's actually productive and not just more of the same?
Well, they suggest working closely with Muslim communities in the West to counter radicalization through education, economic opportunities, social integration programs.
So more community outreach, more
Right.
interfaith dialogue, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
It sounds like it's about humanizing the other,
Right.
recognizing our shared humanity.
Exactly. It's about breaking down stereotypes and building relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. And on the international level, the source advocates for increased cooperation with governments in the Arab world
Right.
to address mutual security concerns while also promoting human rights and democratic values.
That sounds like a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
It's about finding common ground, right? Working together to fight terrorism while also addressing the legitimate concerns and grievances
Exactly.
of those who feel marginalized or oppressed.
It's about recognizing that security and human rights are not mutually exclusive. They're interconnected and essential for creating a more just and peaceful world.
Okay, so we've talked about addressing the root causes through things like promoting good governance and economic development.
Right.
And we've touched on the need for enhanced engagement and dialogue. What's the third pillar of this approach?
Well, the source calls it disruption of extremist networks.
Okay.
This is where those more traditional counterterrorism tactics come into play. Things like improving intelligence sharing between nations, enhancing cybersecurity efforts to counter online radicalization, and cutting off the funding sources for terrorism.
So this is where we go after the money, track down terrorist cells,
Right.
and try to prevent attacks before they happen.
Yes, but the source emphasizes that these tactics need to be part of a broader strategy.
Right.
They can't be the only focus. You can't just disrupt networks without also addressing the underlying conditions that allow them to flourish in the first place.
It's like playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You knock down one threat,
Right.
another one pops up somewhere else.
Yeah.
You have to address the whole system,
Right.
the environment that allows these groups to thrive.
Exactly. It's a two-pronged approach.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It makes the complexity of the problem much clearer.
Yeah.
But disrupting networks and addressing root causes sounds like a lot of work. What else does the source suggest?
Well, they also advocate for a range of cultural and educational initiatives aimed at countering extremist narratives and promoting understanding between the West and the Muslim world.
Okay.
Think of things like, cultural exchange programs, educational initiatives, and media campaigns
Right.
that challenge stereotypes, promote tolerance, and foster a more nuanced and accurate understanding of different cultures and religions.
It makes sense.
Right.
It's about combating the propaganda and misinformation that extremist groups use to recruit and radicalize people.
Right.
It's about offering alternative narratives, showing the common ground, and emphasizing our shared humanity.
Exactly. It's about changing hearts and minds as much as it's about disrupting networks and addressing political and economic grievances.
Okay, so that covers the short-term and medium-term solutions.
Yeah.
What about the long game? What does the source say about that?
They identified two key areas for long-term focus:
Okay.
reducing dependence on oil and prioritizing preventative measures.
I'm particularly intrigued by the oil issue. We've already talked about how the oil industry has fueled conflict, instability, and extremist ideologies in the region. But what's the solution? Just stop using oil altogether.
Well, that's the ideal scenario, but it's a complex transition that will take time and significant global cooperation. The source argues that the West needs to transition to renewable energy sources
Right.
as quickly as possible.
Okay, so if we're not reliant on Middle Eastern oil, we'll have less incentive to intervene in the region,
Right.
which in turn could help to reduce the grievances that extremists exploit.
It's about breaking that cycle of dependence that has fueled so much conflict and instability for decades. It's not just about environmental sustainability.
Yeah.
It's about geopolitical stability and peace.
Okay, and what about these preventative measures? What do they mean by that?
Well, it's about focusing on early interventions in at-risk communities
Okay,
to prevent the appeal of extremist ideologies in the first place.
so almost like getting ahead of it before it even starts.
Exactly. This could involve things like youth programs, educational initiatives, and community outreach efforts aimed at promoting tolerance, critical thinking, and resilience to extremist propaganda. Think of it as, building immunity to the virus of extremism.
So it's about addressing the problem at its roots before it even has a chance to take hold.
Exactly.
It's about creating a social and cultural environment where extremism simply can't flourish.
Precisely. It's about investing in prevention rather than just reaction.
That sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's a lot harder to do in practice than it sounds on paper.
It certainly requires a long-term commitment and a willingness to address the underlying social, economic, and political conditions that contribute to radicalization.
Yeah.
But The source argues that this is the only way to truly break the cycle of violence and create a more peaceful and secure future.
That's a lot. It's a big ask.
It is.
But you got to start somewhere.
Indeed. The first step is recognizing the complexity of the problem and acknowledging that there are no easy answers.
Yeah. This deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've only scratched the surface of this incredibly complex and sensitive topic.
Yeah.
But I feel like I have a much better understanding of the historical context,
Right.
the contributing factors, and the potential solutions.
And that's the goal, isn't it?
Yeah.
To provide you with the tools and insights you need to form your own conclusions.
Right.
But before we wrap up completely, I do want to leave you with one final thought.
All right. Lay it on me. What's the parting wisdom?
Well, we've talked a lot about the role of oil, right? Throughout this entire discussion.
We have.
It's fueled conflict, funded extremism, and shaped Western foreign policy in the region for decades.
Right.
But what happens if that equation changes? What happens as the world transitions to renewable energy sources? How will that shift in power dynamics impact the region and the dynamics of terrorism?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And honestly, I have no idea what the answer is,
Yeah,
but it's definitely something to ponder. It could be a game changer, for better or worse.
exactly. The future is uncertain, but by understanding the past and the forces at play in the present, we can at least try to navigate that uncertainty with a bit more wisdom and foresight.
Well said. And on that note, we'll have to leave it there for today. But as always, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic and forming your own conclusions. There's a wealth of information out there, and it's up to each of us to engage with it critically and thoughtfully. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we were talking about solutions, potential solutions to this incredibly complex issue of Islamic terrorism. Man, that was a lot of information to take in.
It was, yeah, definitely a lot to process. It's a topic that really kind of forces us to think critically about history and culture and geopolitics and how all those things are interconnected, you know?
Absolutely. And you left us with that real cliffhanger. How might the global shift toward renewable energy, impact everything we've been talking about? It's like trying to predict the ripple effects of this major energy transition.
It really is. It really is. Yeah. Remember, oil wealth has been so central to, everything we've talked about. The rise of these extremist ideologies, the funding of these terrorist groups, and even the West's involvement in the region. So as that oil wealth starts to diminish, those ripples are going to be felt far and wide.
So less money flowing to regimes that support extremist groups.
Right.
Less incentive for Western intervention.
Right.
On the surface, that sounds like a positive shift.
Yeah, it definitely has that potential,
Right.
to disrupt those existing power structures and create opportunities for new approaches.
Okay.
However, we can't just assume that it's going to be this simple problem-solved scenario.
Right.
There's also that potential for, instability and unforeseen consequences.
Okay, what are some of the potential downsides? I'm all for renewable energy, but I'm also a realist.
Well, think about what happens to those oil-rich states when their primary source of income dries up. How do they transition their economies? What happens to the populations that depend on that income?
Right.
Could it lead to, economic hardship?
Right.
Social unrest? Political instability?
Yeah, I see your point. It's not just about flipping a switch and going green. It's about managing this complex transition and anticipating the potential fallout.
Exactly. And, in all that uncertainty, there's always a risk that these extremist groups could exploit the situation.
Sure.
Step into the void, offer their own solutions, however, twisted and dangerous they may be.
It's almost like a power vacuum.
Right, exactly.
These groups can step in and exploit the chaos.
Exactly. So, we really need to be thinking about how to help those oil-dependent states transition to more diversified economies.
Right.
How to mitigate that social and political fallout.
Right.
How to prevent these extremist groups from capitalizing on the chaos.
Yeah, it's a lot more complex than it might seem at first glance.
It really is.
Now, this brings us full circle to those long-term solutions that we were discussing in the last episode.
Right.
Investing in education, promoting good governance, resolving those long-standing conflicts.
Yeah.
And fostering genuine understanding between cultures.
Yeah.
It's like trying to build a foundation for peace.
Yeah.
That can withstand, all these inevitable storms of change that we keep talking about.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And those elements become even more crucial, in this world where you have these old power structures kind of crumbling and you have new ones emerging.
Right.
So yeah, really, really important points to consider.
Well, this deep dive has been a real journey. We started by examining, the devastating human cost of these conflicts throughout history.
Yeah.
Explored this tangled web of factors driving Islamic terrorism today.
Right.
And, ended up discussing the future of energy and the potential for this global power shift.
It's all connected, isn't it? And that's the beauty of these deep dives. We start with a specific topic, but we inevitably end up exploring, the bigger picture, those systems, those interconnected systems,
Right.
that shape our world, that shape our destinies.
It's like we pulled on this single thread and we've discovered it's woven into the entire tapestry
Yeah.
of human experience.
Exactly. And, I hope that by exploring those connections, we've given our listeners a deeper understanding of this complex issue.
Right.
And, maybe even inspired some new ideas or questions of their own.
Yeah, I know I've learned a lot today, and I'm still processing it all.
Yeah.
It's a lot to digest. But I have to say, I'm feeling a bit more hopeful than when we started. If we can start to address those root causes, those systemic issues
Right.
that fuel extremism, then maybe, just maybe, we can break the cycle of violence and create a more peaceful future.
Yeah, I share your cautious optimism.
Yeah.
It's a long road ahead, and there will undoubtedly be, setbacks and unforeseen challenges.
Right.
But as long as we keep asking those tough questions, challenging our assumptions, and striving for a more just and equitable world,
Right.
I think there is reason for hope.
Well said. And to our listeners, I want to leave you with this. We've talked a lot about, the role of governments and institutions in tackling this issue.
Right.
But, what about the role of individuals? What can each of us do in our own lives to promote understanding, challenge prejudice,
Right.
and contribute to a more peaceful world? It might seem like a drop in the ocean.
Right.
But remember, even the mightiest river begins with a single raindrop.
So true. Never underestimate the power of individual action,
Right.
however small it may seem.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning,
Yes.
and keep the conversation going.